Upgrades.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another JVS movie review. Today, I'm bringing you a review of the close of one of the most promising horror movie trilogies possibly ever created. And this one is MaXXXine. And here's a quick synopsis. In 1980s Hollywood, adult film star and aspiring actress Maxine Minx finally gets her big break. But as a mysterious killer stalks the starlets of Hollywood, a trail of blood threatens to reveal her sinister past. And this is directed by TeamJVS. And it stars Goth, who is phenomenal in all of these movies. Also stars Michelle Monaghan, Barbie Cannavale, and Moses Sumney. Now, if anyone knows, or just in case you don't know, if we go through the history of this, X was a film that caught everybody off guard and caught everybody by surprise. Just how good X was. And immediately following X, we got Pearl, or the announcement of Pearl, as we later on come to find out that Ty, because of COVID in the shooting locations, he actually shot Pearl and X back to back. So we get the introduction of Pearl, and we get to see the backstory of the killer of X. And here in MaXXXine, which is more of a direct sequel to X, we get the only survivor of X is Maxine, and she's now in Hollywood, attempting to become the actress that she always wanted to be. Now, I'll start off first by saying that X is one of the best horror movies I've seen in at least the last 20 years. It is phenomenal. I thought Pearl wasn't that good. It was a bit of a letdown from just the high that you get from X, but then you also got to realize how much of a period piece Pearl is, and just the movements of it, I didn't enjoy a lot. I mean, later on in viewings, it gets better, but it's not something that I would gravitate to ever watching again. And then we get MaXXXine, which is right in the middle of it. Like, even from the introduction of the character in this one, we know that we're in for a ride in 1980s Hollywood, as she gives one of the best auditions humanly possible for a horror movie just to get the role. And then that's when the mysterious elements of the film kick in, as we see MaXXXine attempting to get her life together by at the same time understanding that her past and what happened in X is still looming over her and no one knows about it. And she's trying to keep it that way. So after that, we just get introduced to a bunch of supporting characters. One is played by Moses, who I think is the best supporting character, playing one of her good friends who works at a video store. But it felt like besides his character, every other supporting character was just there to eventually get murdered. And I think that is what throws you off here. We get Maxine being this extremely strong, extremely independent character, as one of the most gruesome scenes humanly possible is something that she does to a guy who attempts to sexually assault her. It's a scene to see. It's great to see. It's a scene to see, though. But after that, I think that MaXXXine as a film loses steam as you build to the killer and you build to the horror elements of it, which I think for TeamJVS's direction style, this film, while it feels ultra 80s, this is as 80s as you can possibly get in a horror movie. But it felt at one point he was playing homage to the 80s, and then it felt like he was just not reinventing it, but more of just intimidating it. Like he's attempting to give you a focus of what 80s horror films look like, but it gets to the point where that line gets blurred from it being creative that he's doing it, and it just felt like an 80s remake of a bad sleepaway camp film at times. And I think that is the issue with MaXXXine. This is not a horror film. As much as I love horror, as much as there are horror elements in it, there's not one point in time where I thought, wow, this is a horror film. It feels much more like an 80s thriller, like something that Jamie Lee Curtis would have started in the 80s. That's what MaXXXine feels like. So it doesn't feel like a horror film at all. And I don't know if that was his point of saying, like, we can do this and celebrate different forms of horror. Because while a thriller is a kind of a more intense form of a mystery film, it is also on a borderline of being a horror film. So maybe that was the purpose of this film, is to play with those blurred lines on what a horror film is and what a horror film isn't. Especially if you look at all three films together, and you get the classic '70s horror film in X, and then you get Pearl, which is a period piece unto itself with elements of horror in it, but nothing overly gory in it. It's more comical than horror. And then here with Maxine, it's more about the mystery of who was stalking Maxine and what's the purpose of them stalking Maxine. That's what gets you intrigued in this film. So it's not necessarily a horror element; it's a thriller element in it, and that's where we get the Michelle Monaghan and Bobby Carnival's characters as the cops as they're pursuing also this killing spree that happens to be going on at the exact same time where this killer is stalking Maxine in Hollywood. A killing spree is going on where someone's killing young girl. So it's just a lot going on with explaining exactly the time period and the mindset that Maxine is in. And because of it, the film does suffer and it moves far away from horror at times. Like even in the course of watching this film, and I'm not saying that all the film is bad, I'm just saying it's not a horror film. And it would just move away from those great horror elements and it would try to interject them back in. But when you try to do that in a thriller, you're just making the killer somebody who I've seen a multitude of times in these type of films. And I think that is the lacking here of Maxine. Because even when we go through everything that Maxine goes through with her, attempting to make sure that her film career goes right, her and this relationship with her director as they're trying to come up with this masterpiece and this other film that's matching the Puritan. This is supposed to be a movie within a movie of what Maxine is shooting, and those are interesting elements of it, but those aren't elements that lead to horror. And I, again, as someone who loves horror, and you watch something like Maxine, I think you're stuck and confused on exactly what the purpose of Maxine is. And that's again not to say it's a bad movie. It's just that the purpose moves too far away from it being a horror film, and it moves to it being a thriller. And at times it's extremely predictable, just like thrillers are predictable. And I think it by this third film we've lost some of the sparkle that we got from X. Like X felt so good, so nostalgic, so retro throwback, but new and inventive. And by the time we get to Maxine here, it just feels like a lot of 80s tropes are thrown into it with an 80s look, which is a brilliant idea to do, but it just doesn't live up to X. And I think that is when, as a director, you have to understand that you're going to be judged by what was the best film in your series. And X was so good. I think everything else, it's been progressively downward since X in these film series. But that, again, that does not mean Maxine is not a good film. Maxine, the first two acts of this film are great in setting up what's going to happen next. It's just that what's being set up is not a horror film. And what's being set up, I don't think it ever lives fully up to that. But it does a great job at attempting to build suspense through Maxine's life, through her having to deal with a multitude of random people for no apparent reason who have so much invested in attempting to trip Maxine up, especially a role played by Kevin Bacon in this film that is absolutely insane. It is an insane role that Kevin Bacon plays in this film that really, he knocks it out the park in this film. But it also lends to more of a thriller aspect of it with the type of character that he plays. So again, I guess my biggest thing is Maxine's not a horror film. But once you get past that, the film is scored beautifully. It looks beautiful. The cinematography is on point. Mia Goth at this point. All three of these films are a version of her giving a tour de force performance. Like all three of them. And she steps her game up to a new level in Maxine. And that's what I'm saying. It's not the acting here. It's not the direction. It is the misleading guise that this is a horror film when it's not a horror film that will really get you. And along with supporting characters who just aren't given enough to build up for you to care when you know what demise is going to come at them. I think that's another thing with horror films. Either you're going to go extremely bloody with your body count. Here, the body count is low, but because it's so low, it tends to feel like you should have cared more about the characters that were just being axed off, and that never is the case in this film. You really only care about seeing Maxine. And when Maxine is on screen, when Mia's on screen, the film is brilliant. It makes you forget this is not a horror film because of her performance. And Ty's direction is always going to be great. I think those are the elements that are always going to be great in these films. But Maxine, out of a possible 10, I am going to give Maxine a 7 out of 10. I think, again, this is a strong film, but it's not a horror. And it does not live up to X. I think X had so much promise. And the path that Ty went with this trilogy, you know, on its face, it seems like this can be an amazing setup for a trilogy. And that led to lofty expectations on what we would get. And Pearl and Maxine both fall well short of X. So it fell well short of those expectations. But it's still a good film. It's still something to check out. It's still something that you could be happy that A24 produced, because this is still a solid film. It's just dabbles in the horror movie genre and plays way more like a thriller than a horror film. It has a lot of tropes in the 80s that can really throw off a film. The third act of this film is not strong at all. It feels like it's just being rushed to get to a conclusion by the time you get past that second act. And that also really hurts this film. And in the end, it's you're here for Ty's direction and Mia's acting. That's what you're here for with Maxine. You're not here for anything else. And unfortunately, you won't get anything else. Those are the two elements you want to see. Those are two elements you get in this film, along with a very predictable third act that can really take you out of it. But the worst or the most egregious thing is this is not a horror film. And that was the biggest disappointment I had. But nonetheless, this is still a good movie you should check out. Maxine is currently playing everywhere. So go out to theaters, check it out. Let us know what you think about Maxine. This has been another JVS movie review. Peace, people.